and welcome to the SCI GUYS, the show where we talk about the crazy, weird, and wonderful stories from the science world. I'm Corey, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host,
Luke
the
Cutforth.
lovely Luke Cutforth.
That's me. Sorry, I'm raring to go.
This week, we're talking about disordered eating. I don't want to make a pun because it's a serious topic, serious time, serious episode.
Yeah.
But first, we have a wee review. This one says, my favorite podcast, a must listen, and it's given us 5 whole stars. It says, I've been listening to them a while now, and recently finished all of the episodes, so I'm currently re-listening to my favorite ones. They're the perfect mix of funny and factual, and I feel like I'm properly learning when I'm listening to them. With their interesting subjects and hilarious banter that I often have to stop myself from laughing out in public. They're my favorite podcast. It's a must listen.
Did you just read out their typo verbatim?
Yeah.
This is a modern day public shaming.
I'm not trying to shame. I simply do not have it in my brain to process a typo. I'm just going to read what's written on the page. I'm sorry. That's just how I work. That's how I operate, man. But this is a lovely review. And if you want to leave a lovely review for us yourself, go to Apple Podcasts and do that. It's in your power.
I dare you to do it right now.
So, we've also got a question for everyone who is listening at home or watching at home or really watching or listening anywhere. Get down to YouTube, get down to the comments and answer this question if you feel comfortable. The question is, have you ever had an eating disorder?
I've never had an eating disorder. I've known multiple people with eating disorders.
You know what, look, I'm pretty much in the same boat. So I have a question for you to start us off. What is an eating disorder?
Ooh, interesting. Okay. Something along the lines of a condition characterized by eating that is disordered, spanning over a certain period of time and that affects your daily habits of nutrition.
Someone's been reading the DSM-5. I've got 2 definitions here. The first one is from the NHS. It says, an eating disorder is a mental health condition where you use the control of food to cope with feelings and other situations. Unhealthy eating behaviors may include eating too much or too little or worrying about your weight or body shape. So that one is from the NHS. I've got one from NICE. Do you know what NICE stands for?
National Institute of National Institute of Care. Excellence.
It's health and care excellence.
Yes.
They drop an H.
Ah, nice.
Yeah. Nice.
Nice.
So it is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. We dropped the H so that we could call it NICE. That's kind of a lazy acronym, but whatever. They say, characterized by persistent disturbance of eating or eating-related behavior that results in the altered consumption or absorption of food and that significantly impairs health or psychosocial functioning. There you go.
Yeah.
And something I think is really interesting about both of these definitions, something that we really definitely should be talking about today, is that it's not just restricting food intake or binging and then purging. It's quite clear from both of these definitions that it is using, the control of food to feel a control elsewhere or a disturbance in your eating, either eating too much or too little. And that's something that I think is not spoken about often in these more surface level conversations about eating disorders.
Well, I think it's also something that it's not obvious even to the person doing it that that's why they're doing it.
Yeah.
So you always have to be taught. Like when you go and probably seek treatment, probably one of the it's like going into therapy and learning sort of ways of thinking about how your mind operates. Like one of the ways that I got better from different mental health issues I had was learning how my brain worked, and then being able to understand and incorporate that knowledge into, oh, that's why I'm feeling like this. I'm not actually feeling like this because this thing I think is going to happen is going to happen, or because I'm actually crap or whatever like that. It's like, oh, I'm actually feeling that thing because this thing's firing wrong, or because I'm projecting this onto this thing, or because I have this belief about the world that is unhelpful, or that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is, okay, so let's put it this way. If you were a common man, your average man off the street, a layman, perhaps.
Yeah,
right?
I am. Yeah,
you are a lame man. I'll tell you that much. Oh, sick burns are getting in quick. Not you.
What my eyes say.
You are putting yourself in the position of a random man off the street who is likely quite a bit more misogynist than you are.
Yeah, I actually don't know what you want me to say here.
Right. So if someone is quite skinny, something that is often said about them is they look like they have an eating disorder. And That is something that is interesting to me because there is very much a thing in our culture of eating disorder means skinny and also woman.
Yeah.
But eating disorder means skinny woman, right? And once we kind of look into eating disorders, you'll realize that that's not necessarily the case. That may be sort of the end point for some of them, but also it's just not how all eating disorders work because there are different types of eating disorder. Do you know any of the sort of common eating disorders?
I would say bulimia is an eating disorder.
You would say, really?
I would say.
Well, thank you. Okay, everyone, we can rest easy. Luke has said he has designated bulimia as an eating disorder. Scientists have been confused for decades, but now Luke is finally...
Oh, wow, I'm so powerful. I didn't realize how powerful I am. Have I just had this power all along?
Yeah, I mean, we've been honestly scrambling about this. We had no idea, but thank you for letting us know.
This is why the DSM-5 is so vague, because I've not weighed in yet. Okay, so bulimia, binge eating disorder.
Yeah, well done, yeah.
Whatever the opposite of binge eating disorder is. Not eating disorder. I will have a phrase, I will have a word, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what else, actually.
Okay, so the ones I'm going to be talking about today, and the thing is that all of these disorders are different. This is not a sort of, I guess, a fully complete episode on every single eating disorder because that would be ridiculous to do in the time that we have. So if you want to see more episodes on any of these specific disorders, let us know. Go ahead to our Patreon, submit it as a topic, and we might go ahead and do it. So the ones I'm going to be talking about today are anorexia nervosa, which is the not eating disorder that you were talking about there.
The opposite, yeah.
Bulimia. There's also binge eating disorder, which you mentioned. Other specified feeding or eating disorder, which is basically the sort of other... just a group of other ones that aren't those three. And also avoidant / restrictive food intake disorder, ARFID, which, have you heard of that before?
No, I haven't.
That one is quite interesting to me because it doesn't seem to match the other eating disorders in quite interesting way. We'll get there in a sec.
Okay.
So let's just run through what they all are. So first off, anorexia, that's sort of the most commonly known one, I would say, other than bulimia. It's bulimia and anorexia.
Yeah.
And those two, are often, I guess, kind of conflated. Would you not think?
Yeah, they're conflated, and also they went through a period, especially probably in the 90s and early 2000s, of being rather romanticized.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, they're the most famous ones. And obviously, we probably also, like, you probably more associate having an eating disorder with being underweight than being overweight, which is interesting in and of itself. So the two most famous ones would lead to being underweight as opposed to being overweight.
Yeah, actually. And that's kind of what I was getting at with the sort of, saying, oh, someone has an eating disorder as a euphemism for that person is dangerously underweight. Because you could just as easily say that about someone who is perhaps dangerously overweight, right? Like, it goes both ways. But culturally, we really only think of eating disorder as referring to anorexia and bulimia. So anorexia nervosa, it's a condition where people avoid food, restrict food, or eat very small quantities of only certain foods, and I mean, what you were saying there about the sort of early 2000s, late 90s, like this whole idea of, oh, I'm a dainty little person and all I eat is a single almond for the day. That's my snack.
Yeah.
That is like a very sort of common joke.
No, it was called like heroin chic.
Oh my God.
Because the idea was, and I'm not using that phrase lightly, like the idea was that you looked like it was fashionable to look like somebody who's addicted to heroin, because you were as skinny as possible, and it was like a race to the bottom of who can restrict themselves that as like the most.
Yeah.
Especially mainly for women in sort of fashion and acting and those sorts of circles.
Yeah, sort of, I guess, media personalities, like sort of public-facing roles. It's all about being as skinny as possible. And what's crazy to me as well is that all kind of left, or not left, but it was kind of changed quite significantly when we decided culturally that having a big ass is something that we want. Because I don't know we've got some kids listening to this, right? I mean, in the live show that we did, I made a very, very adult joke and had a parent come up to me afterwards. So we definitely have children listening to this.
Right.
So my point here is that some people weren't alive or weren't conscious beings in the sort of mid 2000s, whereas we were.
Yeah.
And the point here is that, being skinny was the thing. Having a flat ass was the hot thing. Like that's what you strove towards.
Yep.
And then suddenly having a big one became the thing. And we still got issues with people wanting to be skinny, and have the curves in the right places and whatnot. But there was, I think, a sort of cultural shift away from that sort of super skinny hip dips. Thigh gap.
The hip dips thing that was the big thing I remember from my childhood, was like wearing trousers, like people wearing trousers that were like very low, so you could see their, what are these bones? Is that just your hip bones?
I guess it's just your hip bone,
and you could see them like pointing out, and then the trousers were so low that you could see that. It's just such a specific cultural thing that we just don't really have anymore.
Yeah, I know, right? And I mean, for me, it was thigh gaps, right? I say for me, it was thigh gaps. It was.
That's your memory, yeah.
Well, okay. Look, I have equipment that restricts my ability to have a proper thigh gap. My genitalia. My genitalia.
Oh, I thought you were talking about you had some kind of like device in your bedroom.
No. I'm talking about my
your penis. You're talking about your penis.
Always look. No, so I remember back on Tumblr, back in
I was going to say this is a Tumblr thing.
2014-ish, I guess, would be the time I found out that thigh gaps were a thing, and a lot of people found out that thigh gaps were a thing, and then they decided that thigh gaps, that you had to have a thigh gap, and if you didn't have a thigh gap, then you were too fat. But ultimately, I mean, we'll get into this, I assume. But ultimately, thigh gaps were just a thing of, I'm pretty sure, it's just how your body grows. As in, you could lose as much weight as you want, and you could still maybe not have a thigh gap if your bones aren't in the right place, right? And yeah, I mean, there's all of these sort of things that people were, I guess, trying to get towards, and this is what you're supposed to have. It is very interesting to see how the internet affected sort of all of this, because I mean, before it was the internet, it was magazines and TV and blah, blah, blah.
It's sort of a strange thing. Like the way I think about this, which is quite a specific way, I don't know if this is helpful or whatever, but like, it's almost like you have in any society, or especially like in a sort of capitalist society like we have, you're essentially creating selection competitions, right? So if, for example, you are an electrician, right? Your selection system is you're trying to select for the best electrician. If you're an actor, theoretically at least, you're trying to select for the best actor. Whether that can be quantified or not is different, or you're trying to select for the person that makes people go to the cinema the most, or the person who makes people open Netflix the most. And then in sort of the beauty space, you have, and the beauty space incorporates fashion magazines, it incorporates acting, it incorporates models, all that kind of stuff. You're sort of having these different selection systems, right? So then it's like, oh, we're selecting for who can have the biggest thigh gap, or who can have the most prominent hip bones, or who can have now the biggest ass, or whatever.
Yeah.
And they're all sort of arbitrary. They don't necessarily have anything to do with the goal, other than like, if that's the competition we're playing, then that person will get more people to go to the cinema, or that person will sell clothes better, or that they don't have any, like, it's not quite the same game as who's the best electrician.
Yeah.
Oh, the best electrician is also the best electrician. Whereas the who has the best thigh gap is not necessarily also the best actor. But if the societal game we're playing is the best actor is the person who sells the most tickets to the film, and also the cultural game we're playing is who has the best thigh gap, then the best actor might end up being the person with the best thigh gap, if that's the weird cultural game we're playing.
But then also, it's this weird sort of, where does it begin? But well, not where does it begin, but that the idea of these things being desirable only exists because of the culture itself, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Thigh gaps are not inherently attractive, right? There's not a human... okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say there is not a part of your brain that says, hey, if you're attracted to this group of people, thigh gaps are what you want. It doesn't really make much sense, right? There's not like an inherent attractiveness to a thigh gap.
Yeah, there's not a selective advantage to having a thigh gap, for example.
And our culture is built up that this is a desirable thing, despite the fact that it is likely unhealthy for most people to try to attain it, right? In the same sense that, six-pack abs, rock hard abs for, most guys is not something that is attainable, or, I mean, I guess, attainable or sustainable, really, without being in some way unhealthy. It's just interesting to me that, I guess, the sort of reasoning behind it is that, well, this is attractive. That justifies everything that we're doing. People are just attracted to this. We're just giving people what they want. Sure, we're getting the best we're not necessarily getting the best actor. We're getting the actor that will sell the most tickets, and the actor that will sell the most tickets is the hottest actor. The hottest actor is the one that's got the thigh gaps, and that's the skinniest, or these features, that features. And it's not us. We're not the bad guys. We're just going for what people find attractive. Yeah, but also you're telling people what is attractive, right? The people that are they're perpetuating this, right? You're saying this is the most attractive way to be. Anything else is undesirable, and then kind of washing your hands of it and saying, yeah, but we're just going for what's attractive. You're deciding what's attractive, and then going for that, and then blaming it on the culture that you're sort of that you're creating. If that makes sense.
Yes. I don't know if they're selecting. I don't know if they're choosing it, though. That's what's so interesting, is that no one is necessarily. It's sort of like these waves that pass through us. Now, the interesting thing for me about this is that, I agree that on some level there's an amplification of it by us.
But what about like Abercrombie and Fitch, right? They specifically would only hire people that were attractive to be the sort of people that were working in the store. Mm-hmm. And if you are deciding explicitly what is attractive.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And you can't then say, well, it's just what people think is attractive, because it's not. If you are telling people, everywhere, this is what is attractive, people will think that that's attractive. What's attractive has changed, over decades, over generations, over lifetimes, right? What is attractive changes. I mean, look at the change from having a flat ass to having a big ass, skinny waist, right? Yeah. Like that's a change that we've seen in our lifetimes. And I don't think it's fair to just say, oh, what people want is just changed. We are very heavily influenced by the media that we consume.
I agree, but what I mean is that take that example of Abercrombie & Fitch. So Abercrombie & Fitch had this thing where they only ever hired people they considered attractive, like conventionally attractive people, to work in the stores, to be the models, to everything, right? What I mean is that yes, they did that, and yes, they pumped a bunch of money into that and to advertising campaigns which perpetuate that. But what I mean is if Abercrombie & Fitch decided, let's just pick a trait that if you polled everyone, they don't find attractive, and let's exclusively hire people with that trait and make them run our stores. If the store didn't do better, then the people didn't find that attractive. That they were wrong about that, and it didn't work as a social engineering project. If they tried to go, let's exclusively hire people with X trait, I don't know what to throw out a trait, but like X trait, just because Abercrombie & Fitch did hire a bunch of people with that trait, doesn't mean it would become attractive, other than if Abercrombie & Fitch paid so well that suddenly those people were very wealthy and therefore very attractive.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's as simple as choose a random trait, but you can go from flat ass being attractive to big ass being attractive within a matter of a couple of years. It's a little arbitrary, right?
No, of course. So all I'm getting at with this is what I find interesting about this is that there's two aspects to this, right? There's the aspect which is that what is considered attractive either changes over time, the waves come through, we perpetuate it, whatever, and people then select for that, so they go and hire people with that. Now, that's one aspect of it. If we lived in a society where nobody really cared about trying to get ahead because they had all their food needs met, whatever, people wouldn't then starve themselves to be that. It would just be that the people who happen to have that trait, because there are people who happen to just have a thigh gap.
Absolutely, yeah.
The people who just happen to have the thigh gaps would be the ones who would be in those things, and the people who didn't have a thigh gap wouldn't care because they don't care that much.
Well, there'd be there'd be less pressure, yeah.
Yes, and then so it's the second aspect, which is the fact that people then try to become what the trend is when their body isn't naturally that thing. That's another level to it. That's sort of
but then I think that comes from being told this is the only acceptable way to be. Look, how about this?
This is an After Dark episode. This is
absolutely an After Dark episode. Ding-a-ling-ling, is that the ad bell?
He's ringing again. Why is he ringing this time, Corey?
He's ringing for After Dark, Luke.
Why have we gendered our ad bell, Corey?
Because he's a boy and I want to respect him just like I respect After Dark, our sister show to this podcast, SCI Guys. After Dark is what happens after SCI Guys ends. We just chat about whatever we want to chat about.
If you ever been listening to SCI Guys and gone, God, I wish there were less facts, then you can listen to After Dark. I wish there were more opinions in this show.
More philosophy and politics.
Yes, After Dark is the show where Corey and I sit down, and maybe with a guest sometimes, sit down and discuss just more sort of floaty, woo-wooey ideas about things we think with our brains.
And where can they watch this wonderful, wonderful show, Luke?
Well, they can listen to it and watch it at patreon.com/SCI Guys, our Patreon, where you can also support us and help us keep doing this thing that you apparently like us doing.
Did you say patreon.com/SCI Guys?
Yes, I think I did. I think I did say patreon.com/SCI Guys.
Well, if you want to listen to After Dark, it seems like you should get to patreon.com/SCI Guys.
That's patreon.com/SCI Guys, in case you weren't paying attention.
Now pay attention, because we're about to start the show.
Oh, my attention has been paid and will continue to be paid until the end, when I go home.
But yeah, let's get into the types of eating disorders, and we'll maybe pick up this conversation a little bit later. So the most common types of eating disorders are anorexia nervosa, which we've already kind of touched on. It's restricting food, essentially, right? And you could also weigh yourself repeatedly. That's something that's also seen a lot in people who are anorexic. And there's also this sort of, I guess, view of yourself that is not necessarily correct, in that people who are anorexic may look in the mirror and see themselves as being heavier than they are. So there are two subtypes of anorexia. There is restrictive and binge purge. If earlier I said that anorexia is just restricting, that's because I didn't read ahead enough in my notes. I'm sorry for a little bit of misinformation for a couple seconds. Anyway, restrictive does what it says in the tin. You restrict your food intake. You severely limit it, right? And binge purge, that is exactly what it says. You restrict the amount and type of food that you're consuming, but you might have episodes of binging and then purging. So that would be like eating a lot and then vomiting or using laxatives to get rid of what you've eaten, right? And so some symptoms. I mean, looking at this, anorexia is one of the worst ones on this list, just in terms of what it does to your body. Like it is rough. So extremely restricted eating and or intensive and excessive exercise, because that's something we don't talk about, right? Excessive exercise could also be sort of indicative of it, because it's not just eating, restricting your food intake, it's also exercising to work off the stuff that you have eaten. Extreme thinness, emaciation. So this is all from the NHS. A relentless pursuit of thinness and unwillingness to maintain a normal or healthy weight. An intense fear of gaining weight. A distorted body or self-image that is heavily influenced by perceptions of body weight and shape. Denial of the seriousness of low body weight. And then over time, it can lead to a number of health complications, like the thinning of the bones. So that would be osteoporosis or osteopenia, mild anemia, muscle wasting and weakness, brittle hair and nails. Basically, I mean, malnutrition, right?
Malnutrition, yeah.
Dry and yellowish skin, growth of fine hair all over the body, which is called lanugo, I think. Lanugo. Severe constipation, low blood pressure, slowed breathing and pulse, damage to the structure and function of the heart, drop in internal body temperature, which makes you feel cold all the time, lethargy, sluggishness, basically feeling tired, sort of fatigue. Infertility, that's one that is known about, right? People talk about it now and again, but I don't think it's spoken about quite enough. It can lead to infertility.
Yeah.
Brain damage, multiple organ failure, and ultimately death, right? It's got a very high mortality rate compared to other mental disorders. And you know, you're basically starving yourself, right?
Those are presumably those are the symptoms of starving.
Yeah.
It's not a different set of things. It's like, that's what happens when your body doesn't have enough nutrition and calories.
Yeah.
And vitamins.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but the two main causes of death when it comes to anorexia are either starving yourself or intentionally ending your own life, right? Those are the two main ones. And I mean, yeah, obviously, you are literally just starving yourself. That's basically what anorexia is, other than potentially some episodes of eating a lot and then purging it. Now, bulimia, that is basically losing control over how much you eat and then taking drastic action not to put on weight, right? So that is more about purging. So it says here, it's a condition where people have recurrent episodes of eating unusually large amount of food and then feeling a lack of control over their eating and then taking control or, you know, compensating for that by purging. So vomiting, using laxatives, diuretics, fasting, excessive exercise, or a combination of all of these. So the difference between this and anorexia is that if you have bulimia, you can still maintain a normal weight if you think about it, right? So if you're thinking calories in, calories out, with anorexia, you're restricting your calories in. Sometimes you might have periods of binging and then purging, but with bulimia, you can still maintain enough calories to not necessarily drop to a super unhealthy weight.
So it's almost like the fear of putting on weight.
Yeah,
as well.
I mean, it's kind of present in both of them. I think. What I've kind of gathered here is that bulimia is more about sort of losing and taking back control, right? And ultimately, it comes from a poor relationship with food or a body image or all of these sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, like bulimia is losing control of food intake and then taking control with drastic measures of over-exercising and whatnot. And this is something I find interesting. I mean, we'll get into this a little bit later, but the exercise thing is something that people don't talk about often. And we see, eating disorders as being a girl thing for teenage girls, right? Or young women, which, yes, affects them primarily. But also, maybe we should look at those guys in the gym who are watching their calories, like, down to the exact calorie, exercising like a ton, more than they should be, and are not really all that healthy, right? Because it's not necessarily healthy to cut. I mean, that's, we talk about sort of cutting when it comes to sort of working out, bodybuilding, or sculpting your body in the way that you want, right? A cut is just a diet, like a crash diet. It's just reducing your calorie intake suddenly for a short period of time to drop a lot of weight. It's not healthy, and you can see sort of similarities between that and what's going on here. So symptoms and sort of, I guess, complications that can come from bulimia, chronically inflamed and sore throat because of all of the vomiting that you're doing.
Oh, wow.
I've heard that people can have like teeth falling out because of the bile coming up into your you're bringing stomach acid, you're bringing bile up into your mouth, which you don't want. That stuff is corrosive. It is strong acid, right? It's not going to be good on your teeth. Swollen salivary glands in the neck and jaw area, worn tooth enamel, and increasingly sensitive and decaying teeth from exposure to stomach acid when vomiting, like literally what I just said there, yeah. Acid reflux or other GI tract problems, intestinal distress and irritation from laxative abuse. I mean, laxative abuse is not a joke. I mean, you can really irritate your stomach. It can balloon up out. It's honestly, I mean, it is very scary stuff. Severe dehydration from purging and electrolyte imbalance. So to not enough sodium or calcium or potassium or other minerals, or too much, which can lead to stroke or heart attack. Not nice stuff.
No.
And then we've got binge eating disorder, which is eating large portions of food until you feel uncomfortably full. Which, we've all eaten until we felt uncomfortably full before, I'm sure. But if you're doing this sort of consistently, it's becoming a problem, then that would be sort of a binge eating disorder. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that there's a difference between a sort of eating problem and an eating disorder. An eating disorder, I think, has to be sort of diagnosed by a professional, whereas an eating problem is what you would sort of call someone that's got disordered eating, right? So there's a slight difference there between disordered eating and a sort of clinical eating disorder. Not necessarily a sort of huge or a huge difference. If you've not had a diagnosis, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't have an eating disorder. You've just not been diagnosed with an eating disorder. But an eating problem or disordered eating in and of itself is just it's not good.
Out of interest, you said binge eating disorder is eating to a level of uncomfortableness.
Yes.
Is there a different eating disorder then for people who, for example, eat a lot of food, sometimes to cope with emotional pain, those kind of things, but they don't do it to uncomfortable levels? It's just that they do eat more than they need to eat, and they put on weight, but they're not getting to a level where they're like, "Ow, I have filled my stomach."
So to be honest, from what I've seen here, I don't know if binge eating disorder necessitates that you need to then feel uncomfortably full.
Right.
It's hard to wrap my head around all of it, but I don't think it's necessarily if you're not uncomfortably full, then
you don't have binge eating disorder.
But I mean, if that was the case, then you've got the catch-all one otherwise, which is the other specified feeding or eating disorder, which is basically when someone has symptoms that don't exactly match what you'd expect
Right.
from one of the other ones, right? So binge eating disorder is if you lose control of your eating, or have recurring episodes of just eating a lot of food. And the difference between this and bulimia, because, there's all sort of connections between them, but the difference between this and bulimia is that there is no purging with binge eating disorder. So you're just eating a lot, right? There's no fasting or excessive exercise or purging. It's just eating a ton. So the symptoms of that would be eating unusually large amounts of food in a short amount of time, for example, within a couple hours, eating rapidly during binge episodes, eating even when full or not hungry, eating until uncomfortably full, eating alone or in secret to avoid embarrassment, feeling distressed, ashamed, or guilty about eating, or frequently dieting, possibly without weight loss. Right.
Yeah.
This is the one that I think is interesting here, because it's the one that seems to be, I guess, forgotten when people talk about eating disorders, right? Like when we consider this, it is obviously different in some ways. So I guess it's sort of visually different from other eating disorders in that you're more likely to see someone be overweight or obese if they've got binge eating disorder than you are, if they've got anorexia or bulimia. That's not to say that you can't be overweight or obese with anorexia or bulimia. That absolutely can't be the case. But binge eating disorder pretty much kind of necessitates generally, right? Unless you've got a wild metabolism or you're very, very active or whatever, that you're going to end up getting weight because you're eating more, you're taking more in, right? And that doesn't really match the picture that we've got of what eating disorders are, because we only really talk about the more restrictive ones generally, I would say, right? And so I think it's interesting and important to sort of bring this sort of stuff up. And then, as I mentioned, there's OSFED, other specified feeding or eating disorder. So if your symptoms don't exactly match the expected symptoms for the other eating disorders, you pop them in there. There you go. You got an eating disorder, but it's too quirky, too weird. Pop you in there. It's the most common eating disorder. So
right,
that's essentially what it's saying there, is that, like, it is more common to have, I guess, sort of unexpected features, or features that don't exactly fit the symptoms of any specific eating disorder.
And
right?
that OSFED can specifically be, it can be eating more than you need, and it can also be eating less than you need.
As far as I'm aware, yeah, it's just disordered eating, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And then there's ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which is one that I find really interesting, right? So the other eating disorders up until this point have been about a sort of relationship with food. It's about sort of control with eating. It's about, there's a lot of feelings in there about eating and food in and of itself, and, weight gain, weight loss, that all comes into it. ARFID is not like those at all. I find it very interesting. We could probably do a whole episode on this. It's when someone avoids certain foods or limits how much they eat, or both, but it's got nothing to do with body weight or shape. It doesn't influence ARFID at all. Negative feelings over the smell, taste, or texture are more likely are indicative of that. A response to past period of food that was upsetting, for example, choking or being sick after eating something, or not feeling hungry, or just a lack of interest in eating. Now, I mean, can you think of any, perhaps, group of people that might...
Vegans.
What? I was thinking more people that are, like, with autism, right? Autistic people.
Oh, yes.
As in, you can see, like, texture issues and whatnot, or, having, like, a strong reaction to, like, having had a bad reaction to something in the past, that really sticking with you.
Yeah.
Things like that. I mean, as far as I'm aware, you can see ARFID quite a bit, like, a little bit more in people who are autistic, but... it was previously known as selective eating disorder. It's essentially, it's limiting food, but without worrying about weight or anything like that. It's most common in middle childhood, usually has an earlier onset than other eating disorders. And, a lot of kids can be picky eaters, right? But a child with ARFID doesn't eat enough calories to grow and develop properly, and an adult doesn't eat enough to maintain basic body function. So symptoms of this would be dramatic restriction of types or amount of food eating, lack of appetite or interest in food, dramatic weight loss, upset stomach, abdominal pain, or other GI issues with no other known cause, and a limited range of preferred foods that become even more limited, picky eating that gets progressively worse. And you can see how that kind of would line up with some autistic traits of, having issues with textures and smells and tastes. And so, there's the idea of safe foods, right? That vegans have safe foods. When I go to the US, I need to have safe foods that I know that I can have without having to check the label. And you can see a similar thing in autistic people who may need, and this isn't all autistic people, obviously, but who may need safe foods that have textures that they know that will not sort of irritate or agitate them, that have flavors and smells that are familiar, that won't make them feel sick or put them off or anything like that, right? Like, you can see how those two things sort of tie in together. And ARFID stands apart from the rest of them in that it is not to do with looks or weight or anything like that, or even necessarily a relationship with eating, so much as it is about just not liking the food itself.
The reason I said vegans, by the way, well, firstly, because the first thing you said was restricting certain types of food, and I also because when I first turned vegan, I didn't know how to do it very well, and I lost so much weight that people thought I had an eating disorder, and I wondered whether that, like, I didn't think I had an eating disorder. I didn't have an eating disorder, obviously.
You just didn't know how to feed yourself properly.
Just wasn't very good at being vegan.
Yeah,
but I was like skeletal. I wasn't very well.
Really?
Yeah. I had malnutrition essentially.
I feel like you might have mentioned this before, which is why I messaged you with like a trigger warning before this episode.
Oh,
Jesus.
ED.
Yeah.
I thought you meant erectile dysfunction. I thought you were going like, any problems with erectile dysfunction? I would do an episode of ED, eating disorder. Not okay, right. I was like, that's very sweet of you, Corey, but okay. Nice, but that's nice of you to, very progressive, well
I can't
done.
believe it's just now that you put those two. Amazing.
Oh, God.
Oh, my Lord. No, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing there, right? That, you know, when you become vegan, when you go vegan, you don't know how to feed yourself, and it can dramatically affect, you know, what you look like. It can dramatically affect your weight. And I think it's just something that goes to show you that if you're going to go vegan, do it gently, do it gradually. Don't just go cold turkey or cold tofurkey like we did, because you will maybe be malnourished.
Yeah.
Not because veganism can't give you the proper nourishment, because you're a dum-dum who doesn't know how to make vegan food that's healthy for you.
And probably, I don't know the realities of your body and how the nutrition works, but your body's probably expecting certain types of foods.
Sure, yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily know what it's doing with these new things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's far better, I would say, to change your diet gradually, rather than all at once. At the very least, just so you know how to do it.
Yeah.
Right. So that's all those sort of types of common eating disorder. Again, as I've said, if you want us to do an episode on any of those specifically, we absolutely can. I just thought it'd be good to cover them in general for an episode. So quickly, just covering the epidemiology. So over 700,000 people in the UK have an eating disorder, 90% of whom are female. It's likely an underestimate, apparently, because a lot of cases don't present to, you know, health services, which makes sense. And I would say, and this is fully just me saying this, so grain of salt, isn't based on data or research. I would say there's probably an underdiagnosis of eating disorders in men because of the cultural views of sort of masculinity, right? So you wouldn't necessarily think of a guy who goes to the gym a lot and restricts his food intake and is very conscious about his weight and will cut if he feels like he's getting too bulky or whatever. You wouldn't think of him as having an eating disorder necessarily, even if he were to say have all of the sort of like, you know, all of the sort of features of certain eating disorders. And, you know, you've got people who are using laxatives or vomiting or whatever to make weight for, weigh-ins for fighting competitions.
Well, they also do. I mean,
MMA or boxing or whatever.
Yeah, there is like there's a valid version of that, which is where they like run really fast to get rid of all the water in their body, to like weigh less. And then they quickly rehydrate straight away. But yeah, I didn't know that they were also doing laxatives.
I mean, I think I would assume that some people,
if there's a possibility of doing it, someone will have tried it. As long as it's not against the rules.
Right. Is that people likely would try to do that if possible. I mean, on top of that, you can think of Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, right? Big old sexy old Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. Do you know what he did to look like that? He dehydrated himself.
Really?
Oh my God, yes.
So he was actually like a prune.
Well, no, okay, so to lose that water weight, he would be dehydrated so that he could look like that. He would get a pump on as well before shooting. I mean, if you speak to the guy, there's a reason that he stopped being Wolverine, and it's not because the checks got too small.
No.
It's because dear Lord, being a 40, 50-year-old man and having to be dehydrated for the course of for one of those shoots, it'd probably be about 2 months, right? Like, especially if you're the star of the thing and you're also doing action work. Like, man, that is difficult.
Stick with the Greatest Showman.
Absolutely. Just let Hugh Jackman be a singy dancy man. Just let him be singy dancy.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, honestly, look at any man in, and this is not to take the conversation away from women, but look at any man in any sort of superhero film role or any action role nowadays, right? Back in the 80s, you could be a what's he called? The Die Hard John McClane guy, Bruce Willis, who is he's quite fit, he's quite healthy, he's a good looking chap, he's quite trim. He does not have washboard abs and rippling fucking biceps.
No.
Whereas nowadays, look at any action film ever, and you're caught between like The Rock and a hard place. But guys have got to be not just big and muscular, but also lean as all hell, right? Unless you're someone like The Rock who gets to be a little less lean, but still he's super lean for a guy of his size. It's insane. And you look at men in that way, and obviously these sort of body things are, I guess, less. It's not less of an issue for men, but it's less sort of enforced on men than it is on women. It very much comes from the male gaze, obviously. So for men, it's sort of a power fantasy. This is what men want to look like. Whereas for women, it's like, you need to look like this to be attractive. So there's a kind of different dynamic there. But just thinking about how this has gotten for men nowadays, like in the past 20, 30, 40 years, Jesus, the 80s were 40 years ago. The past 40 years, you've gone from kind of attainable and sort of, sustainable bodies for men in films to what the hell? You need to be on steroids just to get a superhero role? I
remember our friend, I think it was Kiki, saying about Love Island, about when you watch Love Island, like you like mentally, you're like, oh, those ones are the hot ones. That one's not very hot. That guy's not that hot. And then you see that guy like in any normal situation, and you're like, oh my god, like the not hot one's like fucking hot as hell.
Yeah.
Oh wow, but he's just in this like warped reality where everyone's flipping Ken doll. Yeah. It's mad. Like when you see them isolated just amongst other people, you're like, that's one of the most gorgeous people I've ever seen. But in this other place, they were like average looking.
It's insane. Yeah. And because there's only a certain group of people that you see on sort of in the media, like a certain sort of look that you generally see, it really warps your view. Yeah. And I just want to quickly say as well, what I'm saying about men there, obviously it is horrible for women too, like having to be dangerously underweight. I mean, remember Anne Hathaway losing a ton of weight to play a woman who was literally dying of starvation. And then she was asked, "Oh my god, like what was your thing? Like how did you look like that?"
Yeah,
she's like,
I just did it.
I starved myself and it was horrible and you shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And so you see all of that and you wonder, why are their eating disorders why are they quite common in the population? But what I was sort of saying there is that they seem to be quite underdiagnosed, and I would say that's absolutely the case. Not just because they're not necessarily going to sort of doctors and being diagnosed, but also I guess because of cultural perceptions of masculinity, and also then cultural perceptions of what women should look like, right? Like there are so many things that sort of affect this. On top of that, eating disorders can develop at any age. Highest sort of risk of onset is for adolescents and young adults for sort of, I guess, obvious reasons. It's the kind of time period where I guess you're probably most concerned with how others are perceiving you before you kind of hit 25 and stop caring.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah. So I've got some numbers and data here. Lifetime eating disorders are sort of the weighted mean of lifetime eating disorders is 8.4% according to a study from 2019 for women and 2.2% for men. Right. So essentially, so that's globally. So 8.4% of women globally would have an eating disorder at some point in their life. 2.2% of men. At some point in their life, which is really interesting. I'm pretty sure as well, if you look at different countries, you see different sort of point prevalences. So 4.6-ish in the US, 2.2-ish in Europe, and 3.5-ish in Asia.
For men.
This is just
just
overall, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So, obviously culture seems to have some kind of influence on this, but then culture could also have an influence on diagnosis as well, right? And I'm not going to go into all of the sort of specifics of sort of each of these, of sort of the rates of each of these ones, but anorexia is somewhere between 2.4% for the lifetime prevalence for women, which is insane, right? Like 2 to 4. Think of this: 2 to 4% of women, right? So if you've got 25 women that you meet in your life, or 50, between 25 and 50 women that you meet in your life, one of them will have had this eating disorder, which is insane, right? And that is incredibly true. Like if I think,
yes,
okay,
absolutely.
all women, I'm not okay. Yeah, we're pushing them numbers way up. Bulimia sitting sort of about 1 to 2% in Europe. Apparently, it's been reported as less than 1 to 2%. But obviously it differs. It differs. Apparently worldwide, you've got 1.5% for females and 0.1% for males.
Wow.
Yeah, which is interesting, right? And then we could look at, say, binge eating disorder, which is 1.9% for women in Europe and 0.3% for men. This is a lifetime prevalence. And then atypical eating disorders, they would sit at sort of, it says here, the weighted mean point prevalence for these sort of eating disorders not otherwise specified is 10.1% for women and 0.9% for men.
1 in 10.
Yeah.
0.9 for men.
0.9%, yeah, for men.
Wow, that's way. So the non-specified eating disorder is way more common in women than, and in men it's one of the least common.
Yeah, and some of that could be down to underdiagnosis in men. There's also the very obvious that women's bodies are much more sort of, I guess, policed in our culture, right? It's much more important for a woman to look a certain way. Just look at, say, The Simpsons, Family Guy, any animated or non-animated sitcom where the husband is a fat man and the wife is hot as all hell. Like, I'm not even joking.
Yeah.
Like, it's a super common thing. And
I've always thought of Marge as hot as all hell.
people think of Marge as hot.
Do they?
They,
Okay.
dude, I'm not joking.
But what I mean is like Family Guy, that's sort of canonical, right?
Yeah.
The idea of that is like Lois is this hot wife to Peter, and that's the sort of the thing. But that's not really canonical in The Simpsons.
It's exaggerated from The Simpsons. So, The Simpsons doesn't lean into Marge being hot. I'm saying that sort of culturally, people think of Marge as being hot.
Okay.
But she's definitely more conventionally attractive than Homer is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Homer's a bald, overweight, man in his 30s, 40s, depending on what season you're watching.
Just like what would be considered the conventional average woman.
Yeah. For a mother of 3,
she's true.
She's looking great.
And the baby's been a baby forever. So the baby, this is a fresh baby as well. So wow, Marge.
She's 1 year out of a pregnancy. Yeah. But that sort of difference, maybe some of it could be accounted for by underdiagnosis, but realistically, it makes sense why you would see eating disorders being more common in women, just from how we treat women culturally.
Yeah.
So I could go through sort of signs and symptoms in yourself or others, but generally it's sort of worrying about your weight and body image, worrying about food or eating around others, eating very little, making yourself sick, taking laxatives, all of those sort of things, exercising too much. Or if someone else is sort of like, if someone else has lost a lot of weight, or is lying about what they've eaten, when they've eaten, or their weight, or eats a lot very fast, all these sort of things, these might be sort of warning signs. But there's also a screening test that I've got linked down below that you could take, that sort of will let you know if you might be at risk for an eating disorder. If you're listening to this and worried about it, this is something that happens on SCI Guys often, wherein we will do an episode and we'll be like, oh wait, we got that thing. This is us. Happened with me for ADHD.
Happened with me for tinnitus and ADHD, probably.
Yeah.
I realised this week I had tinnitus. Like, having just watched the tinnitus episode again, I went, that's what that is.
Yeah, you messaged me like 2 days after it came out.
God's sake, I've had this ringing in my ears for like a year, waking me up in the middle of the night. It's tinnitus! Oh my God!
It's tinnitus again.
Oh.
Yeah, so if we talk about, I guess, treatment for eating disorders, a lot of it is therapy, and then sort of trying to get back into having a healthier relationship with food and body image. And the goals are generally just restoring adequate nutrition, getting it so that you're not being malnourished, getting to a healthy weight, reducing excessive exercise and stopping the sort of binge purging or binging behaviors. And there's a co-occurrence of anxiety and depression, that's common, or substance abuse, that's also common. I mean, smoking is something that people will do to cut weight, because smoking sort of reduces your appetite. Of course it reduces your appetite. You're smoking in horrible toxins, and your body's like, don't think I want to eat right now.
No. Anything I eat grew in that. I don't want to eat it.
Yeah, and so there's some evidence that some medications can help treat eating disorders, and the co-occurring anxiety and depression linked to those eating disorders. But it basically go to the FDA, see what they're saying.
Yeah.
Apparently it can change frequently. Mostly psychotherapy, talk therapy, that sort of stuff would be the sort of treatment, which makes sense, other than building the plans to get your nutrition back on track. And I mean, that's most of the sort of overview on these eating disorders. I mean, we could talk briefly about the sort of causes. Like, what would you think?
Trauma, general, like, comorbid mental health problems. I would imagine, like, from the people I've known. Also society, but that doesn't usually get diagnosed as a reason, does it?
I mean, usually a diagnosis is done to avoid making society culpable for.
You're right. You're so right.
You're depressed? Well, what could it be? Could it be that you are living in a capitalist hellscape wherein you must work to survive, and also things are becoming more expensive, and also, you're paying more for energy, but the companies are making more profits, and also the world is dying, and also a ton of countries are just falling into fascism. Also, we're on the brink of wars constantly. Is it that? Or is your brain just a bit broke? I think your brain's a bit broke. You're the problem, buddy.
Yeah.
Take some drugs.
So, yes, I would imagine.
And also talk to a person who will convince you that you are the problem.
Sure. Okay.
Therapy and antidepressants are good. They are good. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying that maybe we should consider the problems in society a little bit more on how they influence people's mental health.
Society needs to go to therapy. Society needs a diagnosis. Okay. So I would say, like, comorbid mental health conditions would be, like, the top number one.
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting it. Like, vulnerable to depression, anxiety is here. Finding stress hard to manage. Specific kinds of abuse. Are kind of
trauma
risk factors. Yeah. It says here, if you're worrying about being slim, or if you feel pressure from society or your job, for example, ballet dancers, models, or athletes, they're at higher risk. If someone in your family has a history of eating disorders, depression, or alcohol or drug misuse, that's another risk factor. And that's not to say that it's necessarily heritable, but also, I mean, growing up in an environment where you're given that sort of poor relationship with food. But yeah, I mean, we don't actually have a specific cause for it. It's a mix of things as usual. There are some genetic factors, so changes in your brain or hormone levels, or family history of eating disorders, depression, or substance misuse, as I've said. There's environmental factors like school pressure, bullying, or abuse, criticism for how you eat or your body shape, difficult relationships, and as I've said, like, having a hobby or job wherein you need to be a specific sort of body type to be seen as good or ideal or whatever. There's also psychological factors. So, like I said, sort of depression, anxiety, perfectionism, worrying about the future. Basically, all of these sort of things where, like, you might need to feel a lack of control and want to then take control, or, having high levels of sort of stress or trauma there. And that would be sort of the causes. But as I said, we don't know, right?
Yeah.
That would be pretty much everything on eating disorders. I kind of want to talk a little bit before we finish off about calorie counting and sort of, I guess, how that kind of comes into it. We've got an entire bonus episode on this. We're going to look into a specific paper on this in a bonus episode. If you go join our Patreon, you can listen to that. But I just want to talk a little bit about it. How do you think that calorie counting sort of comes into eating disorders?
Well, I do know that, at least I think I know, that calorie counting, I think, is at points in the treatment process is sort of encouraged as well, in that, especially I think if you have, for example, anorexia, or you're not eating as much as you should, they like sort of coach you to get back to that number. Does that make sense? I think that does happen.
I
because
think I've heard
at
of
the
that.
bare minimum, like, if you're worried, for example, if you're worried about putting on weight, well, the amount of calories you can eat to not put on weight is calculable. Or at least in principle, in theory, calculable. So at the very least, getting you up to that number where you're like, okay, you're not going to put on weight, you're not going to lose weight, you're not going to put on weight. That might be a bridge you can build with somebody who's not eating enough.
Yeah, I think that, so from what I've seen, it may have been used at some point, it may be used, but these sort of calorie counting, calorie tracking apps tend to be kind of negative for a lot of eating disorders, which makes absolute sense, right? But it's difficult, right? I think the main issue to sort of look at, it's difficult, right? I think the main thing to bear in mind here is that when someone has an eating disorder, there's also likely quite a poor relationship with food there. And it's not necessarily just about getting someone to eat enough. That is obviously the difficult thing, right? Like, I mean, that is one of the core parts of the problem. But to get someone to eat enough consistently, you kind of need to fix that relationship with food.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And it's, to an extent, it can be somewhat counterintuitive to try and fix a relationship with food by saying you need to meet this certain, goal. You need to meet this number. Because, with a lot of eating disorders, the problem comes from people finding a number and being like, I need to meet this number. So it wouldn't necessarily fix the, the sort of relationship that people have with food. I mean, maybe in sort of some recovery, in sort of some types of recovery, calorie counting can be a thing. I mean, maybe with binge eating disorder or, certain other disorders, who knows, right? I'm not sure specifically as to whether it is used commonly. What I do know is that generally calorie counting and calorie counting apps like MyFitnessPal have been sort of linked to eating disorders, negatively speaking, right? I mean, we'll talk about this in the bonus episode that we're doing. But in this sort of study that I've looked at, that looked specifically at MyFitnessPal, took 105 people who were diagnosed with eating disorders, and it kind of spoke to them, saw what was going on there, and about 3/4 of them said that the app contributed to their eating disorder, or that they felt that the app contributed to their eating disorder. And apparently those perceptions were correlated with eating disorder symptoms. And what's interesting here is that MyFitnessPal is, used by people who have eating disorders, obviously, to track calories, and it can kind of have an influence on that. I read a story from someone who was unable to eat anything that wasn't on MyFitnessPal because they needed to obsessively track everything,
course,
right?
Yeah.
And I think a conclusion that a lot of people seem to draw from this, and I saw an article specifically that said these apps cause eating disorders. Now, I mean, we can do an entire episode on calorie counting. I think we should, actually. But from what I've seen so far, and I've not done a huge amount of research into this, there's been a lot of paywalls that I've hit that I've not been able to get around, with my usual sort of logins and whatnot. But after some research, this might change. But from what I've seen, from the papers I've read, they don't seem to suggest that sort of these calorie tracking apps cause eating disorders. From what I've seen, it's people that have an eating disorder are more likely to use it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that using it caused it. Yeah. It makes sense that someone with an eating disorder would be using an app that allows them to calculate and track how much they're taking in. It could exacerbate eating disorders, sure. I don't know whether it causes them, though. That's something that I haven't specifically found in the papers that I've read thus far. But again, this is not me saying that it doesn't. We'll do a whole episode on it,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we've just had a change in the UK, which was very controversial, which is that I can't remember the specifics, but basically every company that's kind of large
restaurant
has to display their calories by default. And that is
on the menu.
On the menu, yeah. And that is trying to tackle the fact that a decent chunk of the country are overweight, like clinically, and that's associated with a bunch of other health conditions, and obviously put strain on the NHS, and we want to bring that down. So they're trying to encourage people to not eat. And I personally, for example, not eat as much.
They're trying to encourage people to be more conscious of the amount that they're eating.
Yeah, and for example, I know somebody who has a problem with weight where they are heavier than they want to be. And she was telling me that one of her strategies to eat less is, as in a positive way, to try and lose some weight, but in a healthy, like manageable way, is that sometimes they'll have like a starter and then they'll have a small pudding. And then the small pudding that they were choosing to have because of this this calorie on the menu thing, they discovered that small pudding that they considered a small pudding had something like 650 calories in it.
Man, yeah.
And they would never have known that. And so they were actually very positive about this change. But then on the other end, there are people, especially with restrictive types of eating disorders, who find this very triggering. And the idea that you have to ask for a calorie-free menu might be a barrier. You might not want to. You might find it embarrassing. You might find all that kind of stuff. So it's very, very difficult.
I think it's complicated. It's interesting that you mentioned the sort of calorie counting thing and how seeing the calories on a menu can enlighten you to things. I mean, I've spoken about this on the podcast before, that when I started sort of tracking my food intake, because I have not had a good relationship with food throughout my life at certain points. And for me, taking a more sort of active sort of role in that, an active view of it, has been helpful, right? And one thing I found out is that mushrooms, for example, right? Mushrooms, you think mushrooms, high in protein, good protein source for vegans, and they can replace a meat in a meal. Mushrooms, a punnet of mushrooms is under 100 calories, often. Like 300 grams of mushrooms, 300 grams of mushrooms. I'm going to look at the calories for 300 grams of mushrooms. And you will be surprised. Think in your head, how many calories do 300 grams of mushrooms have? Remember,
250 calories.
Chocolate bars are about, could be anywhere between 110 to 200 or so. I've seen a donut. Noah sent this to me the other day. There was one donut from this sort of place that was 1,100 calories, 1,100 calories, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of a new sort of range, right? A normal block of tofu, your usual block of tofu, usually sitting somewhere between 240 to 400 calories, depending on how much you've got. 300 grams of mushrooms, you got your numbers in your head?
250.
66. Mushrooms are mostly water.
That's
66 calories.
Insane.
And if you think about this was shocking to me because vegan, some food that I have, in restaurants, they'll give you some mushrooms. They'll give you a similar amount of mushrooms and maybe a little less than you'd get of meat by weight. And yet, that is not nearly nutritionally enough. It's not enough protein. They're dense in protein, sure. But if you're only having 66 calories of them, you're not getting that amount of protein.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things where I think being more conscious of things like that can be a good thing.
Yeah.
There's a difficulty there. And this is not me saying calorie counts on menus are absolutely good. I think that calorie counts on menus are incomplete. I think the government has done a very poor job of what they want to do. We'll get into that in a sec. But I think that having more information about what we're consuming can be really beneficial. The thing is that if you're in recovery for an eating disorder, that's not what you need. But in the same sense that if you're in recovery for depression or you're in any sort of mental health issue or any physical health issue, right? What you need, your recovery steps, are not necessarily going to align with what is best for the average person. And this is why I want to look into sort of how calorie counting apps affect eating disorders, or how they sort of what their role is in the formation of eating disorders. Because I don't know, I feel like if we were to teach people effectively about what they're putting into their bodies, people could be healthier and have a better relationship with food. Now, if we were there's this idea of, I guess, what's the word? Intuitive eating, which makes which makes a ton of sense. And it's ridiculous that it's even got a name, intuitive eating, just eating, based on the cravings of your body and listening to your body, and eating based on that rather than tracking any sort of specific thing. That's a great way of doing it. It's hard to do if you have no idea sort of, what is in your food, right? If you have no idea that an entire punnet of mushrooms, an entire 1 pound odd box of mushrooms is not giving you, enough energy.
Less than a Kit Kat.
Yeah, less than half a Kit Kat, or maybe about half a Kit Kat's worth of energy.
One finger. One Kit Kat finger in 300 grams of mushrooms.
Yeah, and your stomach doesn't feel calories, right?
No, yeah.
It feels volume of stuff.
Yeah. Which
is why you can eat, thousands and thousands of calories of something that's very dense in energy. But let's say if you were to eat, weight by weight salad or
sugar,
pure
sugar,
right?
Yeah,
you could eat way more calories of the sugar than you could the salad, but that's just because they're filling up a certain amount of space. But yeah, I think it can be really beneficial to have more information, but along with that, you need other things. So for example, the calorie counts on menus are incomplete, right? That's just a calorie count. A calorie count isn't enough to give you an idea of what you're eating.
Yeah.
You need macros, right? You need at the very minimum, I would say protein, carbs, and fat.
Because you were telling me, I think I learned possibly live on the podcast or not, maybe not, but like getting protein, there's the joke about veganism, where do you get your protein? But you do genuinely sometimes struggle to get the amount of protein you need to have as a vegan without deliberately doing it. Unless you're eating like tofu every day, or like if you're eating replacement burgers every day, you're probably going to get it, but they'll be unhealthy in different ways, right? And so something like, for example, Corey introduced me to the idea of protein to calorie ratio being important.
That's what I pay attention to.
Yeah, that's what's important. It's not about like how many calories you're eating or how much protein you're eating. It's about the ratio between the calories and protein. Because you can genuinely find it difficult to get enough protein to either maintain muscle mass or increase muscle mass whilst not going over your calorie limit, like your advised calorie limit for the day as a vegan, unless you find protein-rich vegan sources.
This is what winds me up about advertising. And there's this great TikTok person on TikTok that I've seen come up a few times. I have no idea what they're called or what they do. They've just shown up every now and then, where they take any sort of item of food and then they repackage it. They sort of design new packaging to make it seem healthy. And one of the things that you see on packaging a lot is something says high in protein or a source of protein. Peanuts, source of protein.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, peanuts are mostly fat. And I guess they've got quite a bit of protein, but their protein to calorie is not super high. At least, I mean, the ratio there is a bit off. Chickpeas, super high in protein. Well, I mean, actually, I would look at chickpeas as more of a sort of high protein carb source rather than a protein source in and of themselves, because they are high. They're high in both. I mean, chickpeas are quite good. Lentils are great. They've got like a sort of what is it? Let's say 100 calories is maybe 10 grams of protein-ish for lentils, roughly. We're about there. That's pretty good, right? That means that
you're not eating lentils all day.
You're not eating lentils all day. But if your standard intake for a person is about 2,500 calories a day, and you've got to get 50 grams of protein, and that's just for the average person, just to have the amount of protein that they want to have. If you want to build muscle mass, or if you're a bit bigger, or you've got more sort of muscle on your body, or anything sort of like that, you want to have a bit more protein, right? So that 50 grams to 2,500 calories, you're not necessarily going to make that if you don't know sort of what the ratios there are. I mean, you might be able to, you might be fine, but some people are sort of malnourished in a sense. Some people get not enough protein. Some people don't get enough of the certain vitamins and minerals because they don't know what they're bloody eating. And advertising comes into this as well. Like if you think about the sort of how it was the Department of Agriculture that built that sort of food pyramid in the US.
You want to hear about real life conspiracy theories? That's a real life conspiracy theory.
It sells corn. The US has so much corn, and they don't know what to do with it.
The first level is like syrup bread and corn.
It's
ridiculous. Like what? Who needs to eat bread and corn?
Yeah,
and also the bread is made of flour that's fortified by the government.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the case in the US, but it's the case in the UK. The government puts this sounds like a conspiracy theory. The government puts like niacin and vitamin D or stuff in the flour to fortify, because government policy is generally to try and give people their nutrition without teaching them how to do it.
Yeah.
So you make the assumption they eat meat, they make the assumption they eat eggs, they make the assumption they eat milk, and you make the assumption they eat bread, and then you put a bunch of stuff in the bread that gives them the stuff they don't get from those things, and then you go, right, stupid people, eat, rather than just sitting people down for like a couple days a year at school and teaching them how to feed themselves.
Well, this is the main thing here, right? This is what my issue is, because, okay, calorie counts on menus, not a good idea. I personally benefit from it in some way, but generally, if it doesn't have macros, it's still not super useful to me.
Yeah.
Now, if you were to have these calorie counts on menus be, say, an optional thing, as in you have both. All you need to, you've got sort of both on the table. Clearly, it's sort of calorie and no calorie. You could pick up the no calorie if you want to, or at the back of a menu it has, say, all of the nutritional information for all of the items on the menu. Or there's one specific menu that just has, you've got separate drinks menus. Yeah. Here's a nutrition menu. It's on the table. Touch it if you want. Don't touch it if you don't want. Right? Makes it easy enough for everyone. Right? If you had something like that had the full nutritional information alongside the calories, that was in a separate menu that was also on the tables. You didn't need to ask for it, but also you don't need to read it if you don't want to.
Yeah.
That would solve a lot of issues there. But on top of that, just education from the ground up of here is how to feed yourself, and like sort of like here is what could lead to eating disorders. All of, like getting in there first and stopping that issue, and then people wouldn't necessarily have that poor relationship with food. Wherein having more information could lead to restrictive it could lead to restrictive habits.
Yeah.
The point is that more information isn't necessarily bad. We just live in a culture where having that information makes you want to get to this ideal that is unhealthy. So I don't think that calorie counting inherently is necessarily bad in all cases. I don't think that having nutritional information is necessarily bad in all cases. I think it's probably better for people to know a little bit more about nutrition because it will solve a lot of problems. But on top of that, you need to then consider how this affects eating disorders because we 10% of women, right, having this specific, like certain eating disorders, right? That's insane. Maybe we should tackle both of these problems at once because just trying to go for the sort of obesity epidemic is not going to completely fix the problem because you're just gonna exacerbate eating disorders, right? Like there is a balance here. There is a way of doing this. And the government doesn't care. They just let's just put calorie counts on menus to make people eat less. But how are they going to eat less if they don't know what is a healthy sort of amount and way to eat, right? Like if you don't have that knowledge or education, then putting calorie counts on menus is only going to affect the people who are just going to restrict it, right? And the people who actually understand what's going on, right? There's those two groups of people, and it's only going to affect them. General day-to-day people is probably not, but it could lead to some of them developing eating disorders if they're already at risk, right? Like,
I'll tell you one thing that MyFitnessPal does well.
Yeah.
That's very interesting is that it does give you your calorie target for you.
Yeah.
Because we have this really dumb system, which is 2,000 calories for women, 2,500 calories for men. It's like, Corey, you're like half a foot taller than me.
Yeah.
You definitely have a different calorie intake than I do.
100%.
Like we're just different people.
Yeah.
There are very small people. There are very, very tall people.
Yeah.
And like, it wouldn't be a complicated thing. Like that app is doing it. It wouldn't be a complicated thing to have. Maybe it exists. Maybe there's a government or an NHS website that says enter your age, enter your height, that kind of thing. A few things about yourself, and it gives you an actual. This is what you should be targeting.
But it's a bit harder than that though. Because it's not
but it's
just
better
your
than
size.
2,500, 2,000.
It is, but it's based on your size, activity level, general just metabolism. There's lots of factors that come into it. So being broad isn't necessarily bad, but I think saying 2,000 for a woman, 2,500 for men is bad in the sense that, hey, hold on a sec. This is like you're not giving people the idea that this is just a range and they might need a little more or a little less.
And as well, MyFitnessPal taught me that you need to 2,500, which I'm sure was taught to me at some point or is easily accessible information. 2,500 is like is that your base metabolic
BMR,
rate?
Basal metabolic rate.
Right.
Yeah.
So that means that's like if you were to just do nothing or barely anything.
I think it's not just barely anything. It's
a normal day without strenuous exercise.
Yeah.
So the idea, but I play squash and I play tennis, and it's not abnormal for me to burn 600 calories in a session, 600-700 calories in a session of squash and tennis. I'm then supposed to eat 600 calories more, or at least some of that, to match my basal metabolic rate.
Oh yeah.
No, I don't remember ever being taught that, and if it did get taught it didn't go in.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we're kind of taught it, but not enough, I would say. My BMR apparently, and this is according to Body Tracks, this thing that's at my gym. It's not 100% perfect, but my BMR is apparently 2,256 calories.
And you're a taller than average man.
Yeah. And bear in mind, that's not going to include the exercise that I'll be doing, the weight training and all of that sort of stuff. But 2,250, right? If that's set as my BMR. And if I'm moving and doing some other stuff, like I'm gonna be burning a bit more than that.
Yeah.
Generally as well, like I mean, and from my body composition, like this is not something that you will know necessarily because you only see me from like this. But
I see the bottom half of Corey.
Oh, it's so sexy.
Yeah.
And for a good amount of my life, I've had like a little bit of muscle, right? A little bit more muscle than someone who doesn't ever work out should have had. And that's just how my body is. Like, so I would probably then need to have a bit more protein in my diet to maintain that, right? And that's just the way my body naturally is. Like, everyone's bodies are different. And I think this sort of this idea that we've got right now of just this and this, men and women, this is how you do, like, it's not helpful. And people then start dropping their calories to, like, 1,200 because it's like, oh, I'll lose a ton of. It's not healthy, I would say. It's not a good way to build a society that has a positive and healthy relationship with food. Because ultimately, I would say, other than people who are looking to sculpt their body in a particular way, most people wouldn't need to look at calorie information or anything like that, other than, like maybe people who are looking after or trying to raise, like, children to be healthier and all of that sort of stuff. If you're an adult, you just living your life, you probably shouldn't need to be checking calories or anything. You should be just intuitively eating, just listening to your body, eating when you're hungry, eating what feels right, all of that sort of stuff. Having a good, like, sort of having enough of a knowledge of that to begin with, that you can just kind of wing it. Because I can just kind of wing it and do all right. I don't need to track calories or protein now. I know generally, and I can feel generally what is about right, But that doesn't come if you have no idea what's going on with food at all. Like, people who think that mushrooms are really high in protein and like a good replacement for meat are not going to be able to do that sort of thing. So for me, it kind of all comes down to education. We need to teach people things. Woo.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is it for this episode. One thing left to do. It's a quickfire quiz.
Dun, 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 dun. Erectile dysfunction edition.
So the rules for the quickfire quiz are the same as always. When it's just the two of us, I will ask one question. That is just one question. Luke, you will battle against the person at home. If they answer it before you, they can leave a comment and let us know that they beat you. Is that okay?
That is okay.
And don't forget, you got to wait till I've finished asking the question before you can answer the question. No cheating, people at home, and no cheating to you, Luke. So, my question for you is, what does ARFID stand for?
Alternative. No. Okay, go. Oh, God. What? Why has this gone? Okay.
You got that right?
The A stands for
Avoidant.
Avoidant restrictive intake disorder.
What intake disorder?
Food intake disorder.
Ding, ding, ding. That is correct. Oh boy, that was painful, like pulling teeth. But that is our episode for today. Before we go, we'd like to thank all of our patrons with an extra special thank you to Exacerbates and Glitch. And thank you for watching. You can find the full references for this episode down in the description. Subscribe for new episodes every Sunday. And why not leave us a nice sweet comment? You can support the pod at patreon.com/SCI Guys, or you can find and contact us at SCI Guys Pod on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and at SCI Guys on TikTok too. Or you can send us an email at sciguyspod@gmail.com.
That's sciguyspod@gmail.com. sciguyspod
at gmail.com. You can follow me at NotCar everywhere.
You can follow me at Luke Cutforth everywhere.
Goodbye.
Go away.